Hi, everybody. Welcome. Let me get set and bring my slides up so that you can see. Welcome, everybody, to the 2021 NCEA conference. I'm happy to be here with you today. Today's session is called Providing Equitable Education and Care for All Students Through Collaborative Family Partnerships. My name is Anne-Marie Rush, and I'm happy to be here with you today to talk with you about this important information. I will point out to you now that my email is on this slide. I'm happy to have you email me after the presentation if you have any questions, comments, or if you would want to discuss any of the information here in more detail. I'm happy to do that for you. So for today's session, you really just need a pad of paper or a notebook, pen or a pencil, to take a few notes and maybe to take some reflections of things that you're thinking about as we go through this information. You don't need anything else, so you can sit back and we'll get started. So in this session, we'll be discussing the importance of partnering with families of our students. Early childhood classrooms are usually a family's first experience at school. And some families may understand and know what's going to happen and how they're going to navigate that. And for other families, this is a very new experience. So it's up to us to engage families in helping them to understand your school, your program, and your classroom, and share our expertise with families while providing partnerships with them. So in this session, we are going to try and understand a little bit about why family collaboration is useful and necessary for young children's social and emotional wellness. We'll learn how to honor students and their families as a child's first teacher, and we'll include specific strategies that include families as collaborators. And then we'll start to begin to think about school and classroom policies that encourage true family collaboration. You may have seen this quote before. I'm sure you have. I put it up there because I think it's definitely a part of today's conversation. It takes a village to raise a child, and not just one person, not just one family. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about what I mean by that. But it's also helpful if I stop here and I define what I mean by partnership. So if we think about what partners means and other people in your life that you think of as your partners, I think about people who really do stand together, help each other out. Usually people who are partners know a lot about each other versus just a little bit about each other. And oftentimes are working towards a common goal together. In other words, they're on the same page. And so when I'm talking about partnerships and collaborations, which I'll probably say interchangeably, that's what I'm really getting at, is this idea of true partnership, standing next to each other and supporting the young children that we teach, and helping families to raise happy, healthy students. I'm going to take a minute here and I want to ask you to think about something as we go through this presentation. As I talk today, I want you to try to think about a family, a specific family, that you've had good collaboration with in your experience as an educator. And also, try and think of another family where collaboration was difficult, where you felt like you just weren't on the same page together, where it just didn't come easy for you. Because I think that thinking about two specific families will really help when I start to talk about strategies. So I'm going to give you a minute of quiet to think about that. You may want to write it down, or you may want to just keep them in your head. Okay, for those of you who are very experienced, I'm sure you had lots of families and experiences to draw from. And so that could be pretty easy for you. If you're less experienced, for instance, a first year teacher, you may not be able to come up with families that fit into those categories so neatly. That's okay, just sort of sit back and try and sort of be open to thinking about what it would be like to have that experience of families in your classroom or in your program or school. And so this is sort of a little slide to talk about why we think this is so important. Why do I want to spend some time with you today talking about the importance of family partnerships? And it's really that we have these concentric circles, right? So the child we have in the center of this chart that I have here. The second circle outside are the child's family. The child's family were the ones that they met first, most likely in their lives, and that they live with and go home to after school, after your program is over. And so those people have great influence on the child, the external forces in terms of that piece. And then the outside circle, which we tend to think, I think, a little bit less about, but is truly important as well, is the idea of community and culture. That these children, this child that's in the center of this circle, grows up in a community, and in several communities, actually, communities that maybe are religious, communities that are neighborhoods, communities that include other family members, and include school as well. All of these things have influence on the child. And when we can sort of think about all of those things together, we really can understand where families are coming from when they come to our schools and our classrooms, and what they might be thinking about. And if you can put on this lens when you're thinking about the child, that there's all of these influences supporting children in their social emotional wellness, then it really does help give us a perspective of what we can do to provide support for the child and for the family, and help everybody raise happy, healthy people, right? That's what we're after. So here's some basic premises, basic principles that we must have if we really want true partnerships with families. We really need to embrace these things. We must understand that families are the child's first teacher. That even though we are teachers, that the first teacher was the family, and the people in the family. We need to understand that families understand their own child best. They are the experts of their child. They have lived with them, they understand the community and culture of which the child is being raised. And so they really understand their own child best. We also need to remember, and this seems like it should go without saying, but I'm not so sure sometimes when things are difficult with families, is that families really do want the best for their child. Sometimes we can't see that if we're really in a struggle, right? If families are really pushing our buttons or not taking actions that we want them to take or not behaving in ways that we would love them to behave, we may forget that. But we do need to have this underlying idea that families want the best for their child. And that families, again, come with experiences and expectations of what school should be. So we have to remember, too, that families, grown-up people, also have experiences with schools and classrooms and teachers and administrators, and that can color how they think about schools and classrooms and how they look at schools and classrooms. And so that's a really important piece to remember, that families bring that experience with them to school. Hopefully they had a good experience, and that makes them feel really good about that. But we just don't know. Sometimes people have not had good experiences in schools, or it's also possible that classrooms are very different than the classrooms that they anticipated seeing. So for instance, in preschool, if if a preschool has a situation where kids get to spend time playing with each other and they have a free play kind of situation, we know as educators that there's a lot of learning that goes on there. Families might look at that and say, well, they're just playing right now. I'm sending them to school. Why aren't they sitting at a desk and have worksheets in front of them? And we know that early education looks very different. Sometimes it's really hard for families to see exactly how the learning happens. And so it is really our job to help articulate that as well. From an educator perspective, I think you'll agree with me when I say that educators understand what children need for optimal learning, right? We've been to school, we have experience, we have education that shows us what needs to happen for optimal learning for children, how we can change the environment, for instance, to help individual children learn better, what they need from us as teacher support to learn best. Educators need to remember that they help children to begin to work with other children. Sometimes you may think about the fact that if you have really young children in your program, 3 or 4 years old, they may have never been in a group size of children their own age that they're in your classroom or in your program. And that's new, and that's something that children have to get used to. And educators help children learn the skills to be successful in a school setting. So we take time, for instance, at the beginning of a school year, to teach the rules of the school and the classroom, to teach the routines, how things are going to go, where you're going to sit down when you eat your lunch, because we know that all of these things are very different from being at home or maybe being in a prior program or a classroom that children have been in before. So we spend lots of time teaching these things to children because we know that that helps them be more successful. Once they understand what it means to put your coat on and stand in a line and wait for everyone so that you can go outside to play. Once you understand what happens at lunchtime, how you have to wait for your name to be called, and then you can go get your lunchbox and come back and sit down. And you may have to say a prayer or say some grace before you eat. All of these things you may or may not do in your classroom, but you have to understand that kids need to learn those routines and those expectations. And so we as educators know that we need to teach that because it's different. So supporting social emotional competence in young children is really a key part of our job. And we are thinking about the fact that um, no academic learning takes place without a solid base in social emotional learning and competence. For instance, that relationships must come first. So before I can learn my ABCs or my numbers, I have to learn that I have friends here, that I have an adult who's responsive to me if I need help, that there are ways to share toys, for instance, or share materials. And that over time, I learn things about the other people in my classroom or in my program or in my school that help me be successful and be happy. Relationships are different than interactions, right? I just wanted to say a word about that. So you can have lots of interactions with somebody, for instance, walking down the hall and meeting another teacher that you don't know really well, but you know she works there and you've talked to her before. You might say, hey, how you doing? Um, people who, with families at the beginning of the school year, you talk to them, but you're not really, they talk to you, but you don't really know each other. Those are interactions. And really what we're after is we're after the development of a deeper understanding of each other. And that turns into relationships. Once we have relationships with our families, with our children, we can, for instance, talk about maybe a struggle that a child is having, or a struggle that you're having understanding something that a family is doing. But it's so key to make sure that you have those relationships. And it takes time, right? And it takes lots of experience. So that give and that take is part of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about developing a partnership, is that that's going to take time, but eventually there's going to be this big give and take, and we're going to really understand each other. And the children understand when the adults in their life are in partnership, they totally know if families and teachers are having struggles together and are unhappy with each other. Children know that. And so it's really up to us to make sure that we pay attention to developing those relationships and understandings with families. And really what we want to do is we want to invite these families to be partnerships with us, in partnership with us. And I hope that you're beginning to see now that that's the importance for children and for families and for us, to help us. So here are a couple of barriers to collaboration. And it's useful to think about these for a minute, because when I start to talk about making changes to policies, policies that get in the way of our communication with families or get in the way of us understanding families, we need to sort that out a little bit, right? So some of what you sometimes will come up in schools and programs that are barriers to family collaboration are some of these things. For instance, one-way communication. And by that, I mean that the communication starts at the school and originates from the school to the families only. And that there are few or no opportunities for families to communicate back. So we give families lots of information about how they're going to get their children into the school, what they need to bring when their children come to school. But all of that is me, so us as teachers saying, you have to bring a lunch for your child in a lunchbox, and it has to have a zipper and all of that stuff is great. But that's one-way communication, right? That's us telling families what they need to do. The other thing to think about is what I call only way communication, which is that communication is only sent in one way. So you may have your preferred method or your school's preferred method of communicating. So everything gets sent out via a flyer that goes home in a backpack. I don't know, I'm just making that up, but you know, and that may work for some families. Families may open the backpack at night and pull everything out and then say, oh, here's this note, I better sit down and read it. But for other families, clearly, we may, if you have experience, you may know that sometimes when we send information home in just one way, there are a set of families that don't get that communication. It doesn't work for them. And so they don't read the flyer, or they can't find the flyer, things like that, or they don't read their emails, or they open up their email and they have 100 emails, and so they may or may not get to the email that you're sending them, things like that. And then the last one is really important. You know, judging families for their ideas or actions. I think that we can't help doing that. We're human beings, right? When I was a teacher, I would often judge families for how they were behaving or what they paid attention to. You can't really help that. But it does get in the way of collaboration when we spend so much time saying, well, if they only did it this way, or if they only read my email, or if they only help their children understand to say please and thank you at home, things wouldn't be like this. It gets in the way of us having perspective. So we really do need to think about kind of like, what's our communication? What if a family doesn't seem to understand or know what's going on in school? Why could that be? And then what can we do to do something different to help them? There's also institutional policies, right? So policies in a school. So for instance, you might be in an early childhood classroom in an elementary school. And the elementary school has a family handbook and they have their ways of doing things. And that's great. They have all of these policies. But for early childhood programs, sometimes policies need to be different, need to be written differently, or need to be completely different. So this idea that policies might not actually give families this information that they need. So family participation policies are one example of that. So that are such that families can't meet them. So I think about things like a Father's Day breakfast, a Mother's Day tea. And these are some things that may actually be like traditions in your school, right? Things that have happened for years and years and years. But if I'm a child in your classroom and my dad is not around, or my dad lives in another state and can't come to Father's Day breakfast, for instance, that's a policy and an event that there's no way I can get into, right? So even rewording something like Father's Day breakfast into my favorite person's breakfast can change the ability for a family to actually go to that. Does that make sense to people? Policies that keep families at arm's length. And for that, I think of things like, for instance, if families have to drop off their children like outside of the school. So, and then the teacher comes and walks them into the building and into the classroom. It keeps families at arm's length because they don't get to be inside the institution that is where their children are all day. And so they may not have a good sense of what it looks like, of what it feels like with people in the building, for instance. They may have seen a classroom at open house day or an evening meeting, but it's not the same as being in a building during the day with teachers, administrators, other children in the building, and getting that feeling. Now, I will say a word about COVID here. I understand that a lot of policies have had to be changed and maybe changed in a way that does put families at a little bit more arm's length. Because, for instance, if you have a situation in your school or program where you can't have families in the building right now because you don't want people spreading germs, like that's not what I'm talking about, because that's a way of keeping people safe, that families understand what that is and what that means, and hopefully it's not permanent. Um, so that those are the kinds of things that I'm not talking about in this COVID time, and hopefully we'll get back to a sort of more regular time. Policies and procedures that are hard for families to understand. So, for instance, it may be worded in educator language a little bit. So that families don't quite understand the meaning of some of what we're talking about. There may be language barriers that families need to overcome because they can't read it. Even if they can read basic English, for instance, they may not be able to read substantial paragraphs of English, for instance, or just written in a way that families don't really understand what the policy is for. Um, so questionnaires are a good example of that. Sometimes we do send questionnaires home with families to ask them questions about their lives so that we know more about kids, which is a good thing, right? That helps us create relationships. But if families don't understand what the questions are, or don't understand why you're asking those questions, that can be really hard for them, and they may not want to answer those questions. Or it may be that they can't, for some reason, answer those questions. So taking a central look at policies from that perspective, really putting yourself in the shoes of families and saying, do these policies make sense? Just because something's been a policy already for a really long time doesn't mean it should still be a policy. You know, is this policy equitable? Does it take everybody all families into account? You might want to say to me, oh, I do want to have a Father's Day breakfast. And, you know, I know that there's, you know, 2 children in my classroom whose dads wouldn't be able to come, but everybody else's dad can come. And, you know, that's all right. They'll be okay. Or I'll sit with them or something like that. It's not the same. That's not an equitable policy. And the problem with those sorts of things is that kids know that. And if we think we're pulling the wool over children's eyes, we're wrong. So it is worth it to take a good look at those policies and really see if they are equitable for all families, and that all families have that ability to meet policies and understand them. So let's talk for a minute about how we can encourage family partnerships, because that's really what we want to do. Again, we assume that all families want what's best for their children. I'll say that again because I think it's really important to remember. We have to go back to those questions and say to ourselves, the questions I asked you at the beginning, to think about a family it was an easy partnership, it was an easy collaboration with them, and then a family that it wasn't so easy. It's important to sort of think about why that happened, and are there steps we can take to change that for our future. So we have to assume families want the best for their children, and we really need to view this idea of cultural, linguistic, and family diversity in a positive way. We know that some children come to us from families that are dysfunctional, that have issues, that are stressed or trauma-filled, especially in these days of COVID, for sure. And we also know how to take care of families to help them, and how to take care of children to help them with that stress and that trauma. That's a whole other session. So maybe I'll talk about that another time with all of you. But if we can at least view the community and culture and diversity that families come to us with in a positive way, I think that really does help. That gives us perspective, right? If we seek to understand each family and what's important to them, then we're doing a bunch of things. We are starting to understand and take perspective. We are also starting to create relationships. Once we know about families, what's important to them, how they care for their children, what they need support in and what they don't need support in, we begin to create that relationship. And we can talk with families about their child's strengths and gifts. It's always important, especially if we're having a struggle communicating with a family, or if there's children are having difficulty, challenging behavior, or we need to talk to families about some difficult issues, that we start by thinking about what the child's strengths and gifts are, because all children have strengths and gifts. And when we leap directly to that kind of like, I need your help because little Joey is having a hard time, with his friends, then you've skipped over a big part of that. So really thinking about sort of how you're going to communicate with families to let them know that you know what their child's strength and gift is. So here are some strategies that invite collaboration. Sending communications home in various ways, as we talked about. There's a million ways that we communicate, and you may already be communicating with families in various ways, but ask them what works for them. You might do having text some families, use a classroom app for some families, send things home in writing for some families. Finding out what works best for each family is probably the best way to go about that. Collecting information about families' preferred language, asking them to tell you about their culture, their traditions, their communities that they live in, and really, once you collect that information in the way, really think about how you're going to incorporate that into the classroom. It's not enough for us to just know it. It's not enough for us to just ask it. It's really, what are we now going to do with that information? How are we going to roll that into classroom activities, our curriculum, the songs we sing, the words we speak. Sometimes you can speak some words in a different language. That's the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Create opportunities for family members to spend time in your classroom in a relaxed way, not just those formal open houses and things, but, can a family come in and be a reader? I know in the time of COVID, this is really hard, but you can always start making plans for this when things are easier. Can they come in and help you do an activity? Can they provide an activity that is reflective of something that happens in their community or their culture? And talk often with your families about their children, just in general, not with any set expectations or set ideas about what you want to communicate to them, but just in a general sort of like, how's it going way? What did you do over the weekend? I heard you took Jose to the park. Which park do you go to? Oh, that's a really good one. And focusing on the positive and focusing on the informal conversation helps to create those relationships. And so this is just a picture I sort of put in here to show, here's some families that are sitting on the rug reading a story. Looks like they're going to have some juice afterwards. But it doesn't look like, it's not a formal kind of thing. It's sort of maybe families came in just because it was, I don't know, story time. And just to spend time with their children. So those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. Talking about formal pieces, certainly open houses, but also those tiny connections that you make through those really informal places. The connections can look different. As I said, we can talk about Zoom meetings. We can talk about in classroom. We can talk about it being there in the evening, being there in the morning, as much as you can do. And again, I know that, in this time of COVID, even if you wanted to plan something where families came in like this and sat on the floor with their children, it probably wouldn't happen. But it's certainly something that is we're going to be able to go back to. So thinking about how you can make that work, maybe next school year would be a really useful time for you to think about how that's going to happen. Again, two-way communication is key. So getting to know families, and then what are the ways that they're able to communicate to you as well as you're able to communicate to them. So I'm going to send you off with a piece of homework because, it's one thing to listen to all of these things, and maybe you've come up with some ideas about things that may need to be changed. But I want to send you off with some action planning so that you can create a goal and you can at least begin to work on it. So taking action to make a change is really thinking about reflecting on all of these pieces of communication and thinking about what might need to be changed, what might need to just be tweaked to make it a little better. So think about a policy or a strategy that you have that might get in the way of family collaboration. And think about how can this be changed to encourage families to partner with you in caring for their child. Doesn't have to be a big change. It can be a very small change. You may not have the ability to change a school-wide policy, although you can try, but you might have a way to make that work better in your classroom or in the early childhood center. And then I want you to create a contract to yourself. And I want you to answer these questions. So, and I'd love it to be written, because when you write it down, then you can refer to it later, and that you've really sort of decided that this is something that's probably going to happen. How can a change be made? Think of something specific. Who will help you make that change? It might just be you. You might be the only one, but you might need 2 or 3 other people to help with that. You might need a family to help you. You might need your administrator to help you. You might need a teacher to help you. And then what will I need to make this change? What materials, resources, meetings, things like that will you need? And then how will you know when you're successful? Like, what is the end point? When will you know that you've done what you wanted to do, that you've achieved your goal of becoming closer partnerships with your family? Keep looking at it, write it down and keep looking at it, because that will help you to get through the end of it. Here are some resources that I used today to help with this presentation, but also there are resources that you can use, that you can look up, that are completely free. There's strategies, there's downloads, there's ideas for families. There's all sorts of things in both of these places that you can use free of charge. So feel free to look them through. They're both very large websites with lots of information on them. And I hope that you're able to find things to help you with your action plan and help you with thinking about these ideas about policies in general. They're just 2 resources of many. You probably have some yourself that you look at. So feel free to look around the internet for family engagement strategies. So lots of states have family engagement strategy information on their public school websites. You may have done work yourself on these within your school or within your districts. Please feel free to email me if you would like to talk more about any of this, if you need more clarification. We went pretty fast, so I'm happy to talk with any of you again. My name is Anne Marie Rush, and my email is amrush@comcast.net. Thank you for taking time to sit with me today and think about these things. And I hope I've inspired you to create some really deep relationships with your families. I think it'll make your job easier. And I also think it's well worth it in the end. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.